Maria Alvarez spent 9 years behind bars, believing her husband David would wait for her. Instead, he married her sister, and when Maria came home, she didn't forgive. What happened next shocked an entire town and revealed a dark web of secrets no one saw coming. Maria Alvarez had always believed her life would be simple. Growing up in the sleepy town of Willow Creek, she never dreamed of anything extravagant. She found joy in everyday things: morning coffee on the porch, slow dances in the kitchen, and evenings spent listening to old records with David, the man she married straight out of high school. To everyone who knew them, Maria and David seemed inseparable. He ran a modest auto repair shop, and she worked the late shift at a diner downtown. Money was always tight, but they made it work. Or so she thought. Everything changed on a cold October night. Maria had just returned home from her shift when police sirens lit up the street. She stepped outside confused, only to be met by a swarm of officers surrounding her home. Within minutes, she was in handcuffs. David was already in the back of another squad car, avoiding her eyes. The words armed robbery and attempted murder were being thrown around, but none of it made sense. She hadn't even been near the pawn shop that night, at least not alone. At the police station, Maria learned the horrifying details. A local pawn shop had been hit late the night before. The owner, an elderly man, had been beaten unconscious and left for dead. Surveillance footage showed a masked figure leaving the scene. The blurry image of a vehicle outside matched Maria's old sedan. Worse, a duffel bag filled with cash from the store was discovered in her garage, hidden under a tarp. There was no sign of forced entry. It looked like she had brought it home herself. Maria insisted she wasn't the only one involved, but she wouldn't name anyone. She didn't say what really happened that night. She didn't explain that she had driven the car, yes, but not by choice. She stayed silent, believing David would do the same, that he would protect her like she was protecting him. But at the trial, David did the unthinkable. He claimed Maria had left that night without telling him where she was going. He said he knew nothing about the money. His testimony helped seal her fate. Maria was sentenced to 9 years in prison. And as the courtroom emptied, she realized the truth wasn't enough to save her. Not when the person she was saving had already let her go. The prison gates clanged shut behind Maria, and with that sound, her old life vanished. She had entered the courtroom as a wife, but she left the prison transport as an inmate, labeled and processed like she was nothing more than a case number. The cold fluorescent lights, the endless concrete, and the clatter of metal doors became her new reality. Her cell was small and smelled of bleach and rust. The bed was hard. The nights were louder than she expected, and the silence from the outside world was worse than any noise inside. But Maria held on to one thing: hope. She told herself that taking the fall was a temporary sacrifice. David would never let her stay here for long. Maybe he was scared, maybe he panicked, but he loved her. She knew that. He just needed time. She believed that eventually he would come forward, admit his part and take responsibility. Or at the very least, he would visit her, call her, write. So she waited. She wrote him letters every week. Some were short, just questions about how he was doing, or if he'd taken care of the roses she loved. Others were long and filled with memories, promises, and reminders that she had kept her end of the deal. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The responses were few and far between. They started with vague apologies and excuses about legal advice, then stopped altogether. Maria still believed in him. She told herself the silence was guilt. Maybe he couldn't face her because he hated what he had done. Maybe he was working on a plan to get her out. The other inmates warned her to stop hoping. They said men on the outside move on, especially when no one is watching. But Maria clung to loyalty. She had sacrificed everything for David. Surely he wouldn't forget her. Then came the day that shattered her illusions. Her cellmate, flipping through an old tabloid from the prison library, paused on a page and handed it to Maria. There, smiling on the glossy paper, was David in a tuxedo. Beside him, dressed in white, was her younger sister Carla. They had gotten married. A full feature in the local wedding section. Maria's hands trembled as she stared at the photo. In one instant, everything she had protected, everything she had believed in, was gone. Maria stared at the magazine page for hours, unable to look away. The photograph was clear. David in a gray tuxedo, arm wrapped proudly around Carla, who wore a white lace gown and held a bouquet of pink roses. Her roses. They stood in the same backyard where Maria and David had exchanged vows years earlier. The same string lights, the same fence her father had built by hand, even the same tablecloths her mother had sewn for family gatherings. Everything was familiar, but Maria was nowhere in the picture. She had been replaced. Carla was smiling in a way Maria hadn't seen since they were kids. Back then, Maria had always been the responsible one, the big sister. Carla was the one who borrowed her clothes and copied her homework. They had grown up close, but life had pulled them in different directions. Still, Maria never thought Carla would be capable of something like this. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a knife in the back, twisted by two hands she had once trusted completely. For days, Maria didn't eat. She didn't talk. She folded the magazine page and hid it under her mattress like some cursed keepsake. The guards noticed the change in her, but no one asked questions. In prison, pain is assumed, not explored. As the weeks passed, the hurt hardened into something else. Her thoughts shifted from disbelief to cold clarity. The more she replayed everything in her mind, the more she realized how blind she had been. David hadn't waited. He hadn't even hesitated. Only 2 years into her sentence and he had moved on, not with a stranger, not with someone distant or unknown, but with her own flesh and blood. It meant something deeper, something cruel. Maria thought of the way Carla used to visit the shop, always laughing at David's jokes, always asking for rides. She remembered the little glances she had brushed off, the excuses Carla made for hanging around. It had been happening right under her nose, and she had been too trusting to see it. Inside prison, Maria stopped writing letters. She stopped waiting for mail call. She cut herself off from anything that reminded her of the life she'd once fought to protect. Because that life, she now understood, had never really belonged to her. It had been borrowed, stolen. And when she was no longer useful, it had been handed to someone else. When Maria stepped out of prison, the world felt too fast. Cars zipped by without hesitation, people walked past her without a second glance, and everything had changed except her. She was 9 years older, 9 years forgotten. Her clothes were too loose, her shoes didn't fit right, and the sunlight felt strange on her skin. She had no home to return to, no family waiting at the gate. Her parents had passed during her sister was long gone. David, of course, never came. She used her release money to rent a small room in a run-down motel on the edge of town. The carpet smelled of mildew, and the walls were stained yellow with old smoke. It was quiet there. Too quiet. But it was better than the noise inside her head. She spent most days sitting by the window, watching the world move on without her. One evening, curiosity won. She took a bus to Willow Creek, keeping her head low and a scarf wrapped tight around her face. Her heart pounded as familiar streets came into view. The coffee shop where she used to meet David, the playground where she and Carla once pushed each other on swings. It all looked the same, but she felt like a ghost, drifting through the remains of someone else's life. Then she saw it. The house. Her childhood home. The place where she and David had lived as newlyweds. The front porch had been repainted, the flowers in the yard replaced, but it was undeniably hers. Or at least, it had been. Now it belonged to them. She stood across the street, hidden behind a tree, as the front door opened. David stepped out with a small child, maybe 6 years old, who called him Dad. Carla followed, dressed in a casual sweater, laughing as she handed the child a backpack. They looked like any normal family. Safe. Happy. Whole Maria watched as they drove off. Her chest tightened with something beyond rage. It was grief mixed with clarity. They had built this life on her silence. While she rotted in a cell, they raised a child in her home, lived their love story with no consequences. They had buried her without even digging a grave. But Maria wasn't gone. She had returned, not to forgive, but to remember everything. And eventually to make them remember too. Back in her motel room, Maria couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were louder than the creaking pipes and late-night traffic outside. She had spent nearly a decade convincing herself that what happened was a mistake, a moment of panic from David, a bad decision he would regret for the rest of his life. But after seeing them, so comfortable, so normal, it was calculated, planned. And if that was true, then maybe there was more to uncover. She began requesting old court documents. Some came easily, others took weeks. Her parole officer didn't ask why, and she didn't offer an explanation. She pored over transcripts and police reports late into the night, highlighting every sentence that didn't make sense. Her memory of the night of the robbery had never been crystal clear. Adrenaline and fear had clouded her judgment, but certain details stood out. David had driven her to the pawn shop. He had waited outside. They had both known what they were doing. She had never denied being there. What she denied was being alone. Then she found something strange. Buried in the discovery documents was mention of an anonymous tip made to police the morning after the robbery. The caller described the getaway car and said it was parked in Maria's garage. It was the tip that led officers straight to her home. The voice was never identified. No one had asked her about it at trial. She hadn't even known it existed. According to the report, the call came from a payphone, 2 blocks from David's auto shop. Maria sat with that detail, letting it sink in. She remembered how calm David had been during the arrest, how quickly he had turned on her at trial, how the money was hidden in their garage, her garage, so neatly, almost like it had been placed there for someone to find. It wasn't a stretch to imagine him making the call. After all, who else would know exactly where the car was? Who else would gain the most by removing her from the picture? The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. David hadn't panicked. He had orchestrated it. Every move, every lie, every silence was part of something bigger, and she had handed him her trust like a loaded weapon. But now, Maria was holding the truth, and she was no longer afraid to use it. Maria knew she couldn't confront David, not yet. Confrontation would give him a chance to explain, to twist the truth like he did in court. She needed more than suspicion. She needed proof, even if it only mattered to her. So she began quietly reaching out to people from the past, names she hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. One by one, she contacted old acquaintances, former co-workers of David's, anyone who might have known what really happened that year. Most ignored her. A few responded with hesitation, but one stood out. Eddie Latham, a mechanic who had worked at David's auto shop the year of the robbery. He agreed to meet her in a public place outside of town. When they sat down, Eddie looked nervous, his eyes darting like someone who had been carrying something heavy for too long. After a few minutes of small talk, Maria asked him what he remembered about the robbery. Eddie sighed and said he had heard things back then, things he didn't feel safe repeating. David had been struggling. He owed money to someone dangerous, the kind of people who didn't send reminders. Around the time of the robbery, Eddie had noticed late-night phone calls, secret meetings in the back of the shop, and unexplained cash that suddenly appeared and then vanished just as quickly. He remembered a night, 2 days before the robbery, when David had been pacing in the office, muttering about a way out. Maria listened carefully, piecing together what she had suspected. David hadn't just set her up to take the fall. He had planned the entire thing to solve his own problem. The pawn shop owner had refused to help David fence stolen parts earlier that year. The robbery wasn't random. It was personal, and Maria had just been the easiest one to blame. Eddie said he hadn't spoken up at the time because he didn't want trouble. David had friends in town, and Maria had already been convicted. What was the point in stirring things up? Maria thanked him and left with her head spinning. The puzzle was nearly complete. David had been in debt, desperate, and cold enough to sacrifice her. And now he was living comfortably, the crime buried beneath a white picket fence and a family he built on lies. Maria had the truth, but she wasn't interested in exposing it to the world. She was interested in making him feel it. David's life had become a performance. Every morning he drove the same route to the shop, stopping for coffee at the same gas station. Every evening he returned home to the same routine. Dinner with Carla, homework with their daughter, lights out by 10. It was a life Maria could have described in her sleep once upon a time. Now, she watched it from a distance, unseen and unnoticed, like a shadow following just out of reach. She didn't rush. She was careful. She changed her appearance slightly, dyed her hair darker, wore a thick hoodie and sunglasses when she moved around town. Willow Creek was still small, but people's memories were short. Most had forgotten about her, or assumed she'd moved on after prison. No one looked twice. She started showing up outside David's shop late at night. She stood across the street, hidden behind old buildings and trees, watching the light in his office flicker off. She memorized the security routines, the timing of the door locks, where he parked his truck, and how long it took him to reset the alarm system when he forgot the code. She didn't just want to catch him off guard. She wanted him to feel hunted. One night, she slipped inside through a back window she had seen him forget to latch. She didn't steal anything. Instead, she moved things, just slightly. A wrench left on a different shelf, an invoice placed upside down, a clock reset by a few minutes. Small details, just enough to make him question his memory, to make him feel uneasy. The next night, she returned. This time she turned off the breaker to the security camera system and unscrewed a light bulb in the back hallway. She left a single print on a coffee mug she knew he used. Not enough to raise alarms, just enough to make him pause. Maria wanted David to know something wasn't right. She wanted his hands to shake when he held his keys. She wanted him to wonder if he'd seen that photo frame turned the wrong way yesterday, or if the office door had always creaked that loudly. Revenge wasn't a moment for her, it was a process, and this was just the beginning. She wasn't going to let him sleep easy, not until he knew what it felt like to be trapped in his own life. The box wasn't large, but it was heavy with meaning. Maria had spent days putting it together, carefully selecting each item. Every piece was chosen not to scare David, but to remind him, to force him to face what he had done, not just once, but over and over every time he opened a drawer or walked past a mirror. It wasn't enough to haunt his business or disrupt his routine. Now she wanted to step directly into his world, even if only through silence. She left the box on his front porch just before dawn, dressed in dark clothes with her hood up. The street was quiet, the neighborhood still asleep. She did not knock. She simply placed it by the door, turned, and walked away. No one saw her. No one ever did. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a manila envelope filled with copies of the court transcript from her trial, specifically the pages where David testified against her. His words cold and clinical, claiming she acted alone. Maria had underlined key sentences in red ink, lies that sentenced her to nearly a decade behind bars, lies that destroyed her. The second item was a black and white photo taken from across the street. It showed David, Carla, and their daughter standing in the front yard, completely unaware they were being watched. In the corner of the photo was a timestamp from just 3 days earlier. Maria wanted him to see it. She wanted him to understand that she had been close, that his quiet, perfect life had cracks, and someone was now crawling through them. The third item was the most personal, a copy of a letter Maria had written to David during her second year in prison, the one where she begged for answers, asked if he still loved her, pleaded for the truth. She never got a reply. But now he would read it, along with everything else he had ignored. By the time David opened the box, Maria was already gone. But she imagined his face, his confusion turning into fear, his guilt rising like smoke he couldn't blow away. She didn't need to see it to know. She could feel it. For the first time in years, she was the one in control, and she wasn't finished, not even close. David's unease grew each day after finding the box. At first he tried to convince himself it was a prank, a sick joke from someone who still held a grudge. But the court transcripts, the photo with the timestamp, the letter he had ignored for years, it was all too real. He stopped sleeping well, jumping at shadows and double-checking locks. He became restless at the shop, distracted and tense. Business suffered. Customers noticed the change, whispering about the once confident man who now seemed haunted. Carla tried to calm him, but even she sensed something was wrong. The daughter, oblivious to the tension, continued with her childhood, blissfully unaware. David's paranoia grew, and one night after closing up, he took a different route home. He stopped at the gas station, looking over his shoulder. His hands shook as he filled the tank. The streetlights cast long shadows, and every sound seemed louder, sharper. He felt eyes on him, but whenever he looked, no one was there. Maria was watching just out of sight. She had never intended to kill him, not at first. Her plan was to dismantle his life piece by piece until he understood what it meant to lose everything, just like she had. But watching him crumble, witnessing the cracks appear in his confident facade, stirred something darker inside her. One cold evening, David left the shop later than usual. He noticed the silence in the streets, the emptiness where life should have been. He fumbled with his keys, heart racing, when suddenly a shadow moved behind the truck. Before he could react, Maria stepped forward. Her eyes were hard, filled with years of pain and anger. In that moment there was no conversation, no pleading, no explanations, only the sharp sound of a struggle, a desperate act fueled by betrayal. David fell to the ground, the life draining from his eyes as Maria stood over him. The years of silence, the lies, the broken promises, they all crashed down in that final instant. The town would soon hear the news. The man who married 2 sisters, the man who betrayed the woman who sacrificed everything for him, was dead. And Maria was the one who ended it. But what no one knew, what only Maria carried, was the secret truth behind that night. The story of love turned to poison, and revenge that finally demanded its price. The news of David's death spread quickly through Willow Creek. The small town, once quiet and predictable, was suddenly filled with whispers and speculation. Headlines called it a tragic ending to a twisted story. "Woman kills husband after years of silence," read one. "A family torn apart by secrets and betrayal," said another. Maria Alvarez was no longer just a former prisoner. She was now the woman who had taken a life, the center of a community's shock and fascination. At the police station, officers pieced together the events of that cold night. Forensic evidence confirmed the struggle and showed how Maria had acted in a moment fueled by years of pain and rage. But even with the facts laid bare, The motive wasn't simple. It was buried beneath layers of silence, lies, and heartbreak. Maria never tried to hide what she'd done. During questioning, she spoke quietly but firmly, revealing a truth that had been buried for years. She told them about the robbery, about her silence and loyalty, about the betrayal that followed, about David marrying her sister, about the family life built on her sacrifice. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't expect understanding. Inside the courtroom, the trial was fast and intense. Maria's defense argued the years of emotional abuse, the manipulation, and the psychological torment that had pushed her to the edge. The prosecution painted her as a dangerous woman consumed by revenge. The jury listened to both sides, weighed the evidence, and saw the broken pieces of a woman's life shattered beyond repair. In the end, Maria was convicted of manslaughter. The judge acknowledged the complex circumstances, the pain, the betrayal, the long silence, but the law demanded consequences. Maria was sentenced to another prison term, shorter this time, but enough to keep her away from the life she had tried to reclaim. Outside the courthouse, the town watched as she was led away. Some whispered sympathy, others whispered hatred, but Maria felt something neither. The quiet peace of someone who had finally taken control of her story. She had lost nearly everything, but she had found her voice, and in that voice was the truth, a reminder that sometimes justice is not just about law, it's about the lives broken in its wake, and the dark choices made when love turns to betrayal.